name's Genever. Welcome to the pre-conference special for Regen Ag Chat. We are talking about the conference that's happening on the 24th to the 26th of June. My name's Genever.
And I'm Nic Renison.
So next up on our tour of speakers is Daniel. So, Dan, what did you enjoy talking to Daniel about, Nic?
Well, when we talked to Daniel, he had amazing lighting in his room. And he looked a bit like a model. So I quite enjoyed our chat with Daniel.
Which is all excellent on a just audio podcast, but I'm sure...
Yeah, so if Liz and I are sounding particularly chipper on this one, it's because we were enjoying the scenery. But it's just it was interesting, and he will blow your mind on fungi. That's pretty much, and he'll make it quite simple. And he isn't a supersonic salesman. He's just really, he knows his stuff. He's got an interesting story. And we touch on the fact that he was diagnosed maybe 5 years ago. He's autistic. So yeah, he's shared a lot with us, and it was a very enjoyable chat. And I think he'll be great on the third day of Carbon Calling at our place.
So the plan for that day is he's going to do a workshop alongside Ian Robertson, who you might have just listened to. Daniel's going to be focusing more on the biology. So he set up a company called Woodland Grow, who was at last year's Carbon Calling. The name's been changed to Regenis, which will come out in the podcast. But yeah, and this is not about overselling. It's about people who are absolutely the specialist in their field that want to come and talk to us a lot. So that's in itself is odd, but we are very thankful.
Very thankful.
Over to Daniel.
Daniel, thank you very much for joining us today. First of all, start at the very beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about you when you were younger and your journey over your years growing up, and what has brought you to this space?
Hi, yeah. I mean, that's a really good question, but it's actually quite pertinent for me because that is ultimately the journey that I went on. It wasn't an epiphany when I was 40. It was kind of, well, it probably was, but I come from a family of that have grown plants. So I'm in my third generation of perhaps horticulturalists, where my nan started, then it was my dad, my brother, my auntie. And at the age of 18, my dad said, go and get a career because, plants are up and down and you want to have a career to supplement what you're doing. You always come back to the family nursery, no problem. So I went off to do engineering and then had a career in it. But there was a few things that kind of went through my life that kept resonating. And it was my nan back in the 50s ended up in a world of men beating them with her roses because she was using a particular type of manure on her roses, and her blooms were coming out even better than everybody else's. And she didn't understand why, and nobody else did, but she was part of that kind of that period of pushing boundaries, both men, females, also plant breeding and plants in horticulture. And when I bought a woodland when I was just coming up to 40, so it was like 5-6 years ago, I needed to clear fell it, but I decided to grow my own trees in my own kind of family nursery with my dad as a kind of a bonding thing, and replant the woodland with trees that I grew. So as took my kids to the woods, we collected seed, we went to the nursery, did some growing, and we then planted them all up. And it was that kind of journey that when we got to planting and the trees all suffered a bit of a shock going from the nursery to the woodland, the forester was like, well, this is normal. You've grown them in a nursery with chemicals and clean water, synthetic fertilizer, and then you've brought them out here and it's fungi bacteria. There's a gap. And I was like, well, why has nobody fixed that? Because that seems like an obvious gap to close. And it just felt like, knowing what my nan had done and my dad had done, that there was a way of being able to bridge that gap. And with my engineering career, where I'd worked in aerospace, motorsport, defense, solving complex problems just became easier for me because I'd done it before. So I was like, well, let's try and fix it. So that's that's almost how it all started. Was, you know, at the age of 16, stood at the nursery with my dad saying, you know, go and get yourself a career. But those stories of how life used to be, not in a kind of nostalgic way, but that, you know, you did something, but you didn't know how it worked. And I think the thing that I found useful or drove me was, let's find out what that data was. You know, is it through DNA? Is it through microscopy? Is it through nutrition? What are the analysis techniques? What are the bits we're missing? And it turns out we're missing a lot of data. And I think when you look at problems at system level, you can start to see patterns. And I think that is, I don't know if that's the right answer, but that's how I'm here today, I suppose.
So when you obviously had a high flying proper job, went to work in a suit, sat behind.
Yeah.
Was it like a calling back to the land? Was it something you had to do?
Yeah, I mean, I've spent way too much money to get to this point. It wasn't out of making money. It was definitely a emotional draw back to the family principles of what they did, why they did it, and what was successful for them. They worked with rare breed herbaceous plants for cottage gardens, and my nan was known, you know, throughout the country. And, you know, back then they used to do coach trips to the nursery to see her gardens. And, you know, that life doesn't really exist anymore. It's all garden centre kind of trips now. But the premise of working hard every day, watching the seasons, looking at the plants, I didn't have that connection in an office. And whilst I don't get to walk in my woodland on a weekly basis because it's too far away, the thought that I could contribute to the environment that we live in and how my kids grow up and what environment they're exposed to, it definitely felt like the absolute right thing to do, and probably at all costs, you know, much to my wife's, you know, frustration. It's been an obsession and a lot of time whilst I did my day job, and now whilst this is my day job.
Rises. Go on, Liz.
There's a lot to unpick in that those couple of paragraphs, but I think I suppose it's the problem solving you've learned in engineering and then bringing it back to forestry. That's what I find interesting.
Yeah, and perhaps I'll be brave then. I got diagnosed as being autistic at the age of 40, and there was some aspects of, did I get to where I got to because I didn't know, or is it because of, you know, am I an engineer or am I autistic, or am I just good at asking questions to try and understand things? So it's not because I'm smart in any way. It's, you know, you try to understand things and look at it from, you know, I think differently. So the engineering bit and the nature bit, I definitely feel comfortable in nature. So, you know, being outside, walking through the woods, you know, having that connection with nature is absolutely relevant. But also watching the world be treated the way it is, and how can I do it? And quite often you feel powerless to do it. You know, do you buy organic food? Do you buy from brands that are respected from what they're doing? Or can I actually contribute to society in a way that helps the environment? And I think when I started, it was very much single-mindedly, can I grow the least carbon tree possible, you know, in a paper pot, in a woodland? So I created a tree nursery in a woodland. So in Pembrokeshire, there is, you know, 100, 200,000 trees, whatever were grown at any single point in time, being totally grown off-grid in the least carbon way possible that I could conceive, which is, you know, with forestry residues and just very little power and the way nature intended. And I think having done that without trying to worry about how to make money, we've made loads of mistakes and we've learned a lot. But I think, yeah, most people wouldn't do that.
I think it's interesting that most people wouldn't buy a wood. That's part of, saying there was no level of judgment, but you know, when you drive past and there's like woodlands for sale, who's going to buy wood? He did.
Was that you? Did you see a sign?
It was an article in The Guardian, I think, that said people with pensions can buy woodlands. And I thought, well, as soon as I can afford to do that, I'm going to do it, because I think the frustration for me was watching the stock market go up and down with the value of a tweet, and I just thought, I don't understand the value of a tweet changing the value of my pension, so I've got to decouple it. And I think the other thing was my kids just come alive when they're outside, and I just remember how much we enjoyed growing up at the nursery, where there was trees everywhere. It wasn't a normal nursery at all. It was just covered in stuff to go and play in. So we just spent our entire summers and after school playing at the nursery. So that's what I wanted for my kids, and I just couldn't afford a farm. So I was like, I'll buy a woodland and do something. So we go camping there every year with the kids, and they love it. And so to me, there was the environment for the kids, and also the decoupling from the stock market, I suppose.
Because I'm doing a course at the moment, as Nick loves this chat, and they were talking about something the other day which was really helpful, which is this idea of working in nature, working with nature, and then working for nature. It's like a continuum. And most people don't work for nature, so they're sort of doing more activism perhaps, or making different decisions until potentially they've connected in and with. So it's like a flow of, just quite interesting I've never really thought about in and with being any different, but it's just, you can just use it as the place you are, or you can use it deeply in your practice, which you are, and by doing that you're then advocating for wider change.
Yes, and I think it's every time. I don't want these projects and what we've done to have been, we've made zero mistakes. We've made as many mistakes as we've made progress. And I think one of the things that I do see and hear from people is being able to observe nature. And it's true, you need to stand still, you need to observe nature. But I think it's more than that, and not from a spiritual otherwise. There's data to be had by observing nature. And I think when we were running our experiments in the Tree Production Innovation Fund, which I've kind of skipped over, but that's where we were doing that work on how do you make fungi. We were able to observe what nature was telling us through data. So you were able to see things, even though you were stood there, you were able to see them in black and white. And I think we're used to seeing data in black and white and not necessarily in what nature's trying to tell us. I don't know where I'm going with this, but I think everybody that was on this project has been shocked based on what they thought they knew, what they thought was happening, and then what the data was telling us. And even though they'd been in the woods, the team that we've got, they've worked in the woods for the last 3 years every day, and I'll get a bit of data back and I'll be like, oh, well, what we observed, actually, it could mean this. And it's not what we've thought like before. So I think that's been the interesting part, is by working with and in nature, is the snippets you get.
Daniel, do you want to go back a stage and tell us a little bit about the project?
Yeah, so I'd set up the nursery in the woodland, and the bit that was missing was when you make these paper pots to grow trees in, you need to put your growing media in. And most growing medias are coir, bark fines, maybe a bit of perlite and synthetic fertilizer, and maybe green waste or digestate. And it's just nothing that a tree wants. I'm sure there's lots of other people trying to do good stuff around this. So what we said to the Forestry Commission is the first thing we need to do is make good compost, and we need to make fungal dominated compost. And for the people that don't know, almost all composts are bacteria dominated, not fungal dominated. And the reason why you want fungal dominated is to then be able to scale it, have it as a kind of a mother starter. So that was phase one, can you? So we looked at different recipes, different techniques, different locations, and how you do things. And we got all the best regen people around us. We tested compost that, for people that are in the Guardian with their good compost, we did DNA analysis, nutrition and microscopy. And actually what we found was almost all compost that people are making, buying, using was bacteria dominated. And then the fungal populations that are there are very limited and not very diverse and not very complex. So that was kind of the challenge. And then in phase 1, we managed to make fungal-dominated compost in 10 months, relatively straightforwardly. And one of the things we found was diversity is key. And making compost that people are used to is not the way you make compost for fungi. So there was lots of, what people knew, and then what they learned was putting everything on its end and flipping it over. And then phase 2, which was successful in winning, again, through the Tree Production Innovation Fund, was, can you scale making mother? Can you feed the microbes? And then can you grow trees in the growing media that you've made? So it's just residues from forestry, agriculture, and fisheries, and then plant them and let them grow. Because if you go from seed to woodland with only fungi in your mind, then the tree will grow quicker when it gets to the other end, as opposed to what I had at the beginning, which was that nature gap of on synthetics and then trying to work out where the fungi is and how to talk to it. And that project finished in March, just gone. And what we managed to do was all of that. But in learning how to do it and not to do it, we learned how to grow lettuce, we learned how to grow winter barley, spring wheat, ericaceous, ornamentals, herbs, and trees. And this is the bit that originally blew my mind, but now just kind of makes sense. If the hypothesis is right, it's all with the same recipe. So the mother and the nutrition has been the same, even though it's been all these different species of plants and locations across the UK, because I think we're feeding the microbes, and the microbes are then feeding the plant. So it doesn't matter what plant it is. If you've got enough microbes and enough food, they'll select for themselves as to what they want and when they want. So we saw oak trees with no mildew compared to the synthetics were covered in mildew. We saw winter barley with more nutrition in compared to the synthetics. And we just started to see these patterns all the way through. That was, if you create this, I call it a natural fertilizer, but it's, a biogenic living system, that the system will sort itself out really, really quickly. So we've been doing trials now across agriculture, horticulture, and forestry, and we pretty much see most of the time the same aspects, which is that the land will recover instead of over 6 years, which I think regenerative is struggling with. And how do you get, the soil functioning again? We're seeing it in 6 months. So to go from not functioning to functioning with all the nutrient cyclers and the fungi and the bacteria behaving and growing a crop was literally over 6 months for one of the estates we were working with in the south. But I think the opportunity from that project was, when we planted the tree that we'd nurtured from seed in the nursery, in the woodland, growing it and then planting it, it grew 30% more than the tree that was on synthetic fertilizer, because it already had all the tools on its roots. It had the fungi, had the bacteria, had the nutrition. Whereas the one that was grown with synthetic fertilizer got planted, ran out of nutrition, then had to give up its root exudates to go and find the fungi before it could then start growing. And that's what the nature gap is. It's not that forests can't get there. They do get there naturally, but you end up with that 2-year period where they struggle and they're under stress. And I think that's the same in agriculture. We intervene with synthetics and we get over it because we can do it with tractors and the like. But we're breaking that natural cycle. And I know everybody knows that, but then how do you get the cycle back is the question. And from all the soils I've looked at under the microscope as part of the Tree Production Innovation Fund, what we find is most soils have got plenty of bacteria and probably too much bacteria and just not enough fungi. And that's why they're not functioning. It's not for any other reason. And I think the other thing that we've observed, especially in agriculture, is a lot of farmers have a lot of nutrition in their soils. It's just not plant available. And I think I don't know if people realise that there's a difference between nutrition and plant available nutrition, and the missing bit is the microbes. So if you don't have the microbes, you're not accessing the nutrition. So applying synthetic fertilizer is just bypassing that system.
And I suppose the question is, once you've applied it, so in your example of the tree, once that tree has grown in that medium, do you then have to reapply it or not?
No. And I was talking earlier on about this. With our system, I suppose, we've made the best compost possible. And I think when we did the DNA analysis, there was over 400 species of fungi in there and, a couple of thousand phylum of bacteria. And we're not here to say that that is the community that's going to work on your soils. So we kind of have this insurance approach that, there's redundancy, there's diversity, and the plant does the choosing, and also the topography of your soils and the aspect and the altitude, and by also putting in the nutrition. So I don't know at this stage whether what we're doing is a combination of the microbes and the nutrition, or it's the nutrition, or actually the microbes transition that we provide while the other ones then come up and develop. But what we have seen in a farm in Cumbria was year one, we applied our fertilizer and we ended up with 2.5 times more fungi than the non-treated side. He got a crop off with no synthetic fertilizer at all and saved himself on a 5-hectare plot about 400 minutes because he didn't have to go over it all the time. We applied it in April and then didn't go back again. He then did, after the winter barley, he did his rapeseed, and we did a bit of a top up. And he then used synthetic because for him, he was a bit nervous about a cash crop. And I'm not here to judge, he did it. But it also worked for us as being a bit of a hybrid, because I think there's a view that you either go biologicals or you stay with synthetic, and you can't do both. So it was useful for that. And we've ended up, even we're on our second year now, where it's still 2.5 times more than next door. So for me, success would be you apply it once and don't apply it again, because you've got the soil functioning again. So the fungi fertilizer you apply, you get your soils functioning, you're then back to what farmers know, which is land management. And then it is about what nutrition you need for your crop and how much is in the grain, and you kind of go through that cycle. And I think agronomists and the system that's out there already with all the testing that goes on, tissue or sap, they're happy with that. It's just the tools we're using it's not the wrong tools, but it's not tools that are working with nature. It's bypassing nature.
I think fungi, like even 5 years ago, it was kind of a little bit out there, wasn't it? And people, it's becoming more and more of a thing we need to know about. And
it is. I get a little nervous because I think there's a lot of people that use like mycorrhizae fungi as a bit of a headline grabber, and that's the one that does its job. And I think that to me is a little short-sighted because it's also context specific. So mycorrhizae fungi don't work if there's too much N or there's too much phosphorus. That was their job. So it's got to be in context. And I think there's some within academia that really do look at it as being the whole system, the saprotrophic fungi that is breaking down the organic matter. They've all got a place to play. And I think the thing that for me is you can't bake a cake without all the ingredients. So if you know that egg is really important, you'll go and take that egg and go and put it somewhere else, but that doesn't make a cake at the other end. And I think for me, soil is like a cake. You need all those proteins, you need all those sugars, you need all those things working together. Otherwise, you get soggy bottoms or, collapses from the top. And I think mycorrhizae is often treated like the egg of a cake, that it's going to solve all your problems. But actually, if you don't have enough flour in the place that you're taking that egg to, it doesn't matter that you've got this star piece. And I think that's the thing that, if there is a message in the talking today, most of the soils we've looked at haven't had enough fungi in the first place. So they've not come up on when we do microscopy, we note it as 0 because it would just take too long to go and find it. So they're in there, but there's just not enough of them to register. So I think, yes, fungi is a thing, but also I'd prefer the conversation to be about diversity and abundance and richness, as opposed to which species specifically, because I think we just don't know enough. And it's almost a bit like playing God that, if you only know 10% of the fungal population, how do you know that one will work with all the others?
And in terms of why the fungi isn't there, so is it the cultivation? Is it the chemicals?
Yes.
There's no feed? What is it, do you think?
I've got a few theories, but I mean the obvious one is ploughing and glyphosate and fungicides. They're the ones that are physically and chemically breaking down. I think the other thing which we observe as land management is, the lack of flies, the lack of insects. Just a simple example of, chitin is part of, a woodlouse shell, for example. And, is there enough insects for the fungi? Because chitin is the cell wall of a fungi, as an example. So I don't think there's enough base nutrition in the soil. And I think over the years, and I say over the years, going back to 1940, we've been slowly taking out nutrition with all our successive crops. And now we just need to think about putting all of it back in. It's not N. And I think that's the one thing we observed with our trials that went disastrously wrong in the first season we did this. If you have single sources of NPK, micro and trace elements, the stuff didn't grow. The next year we came along, or that's why we did lettuce, so we could grow it quicker and iterate through the design. When you have multiple sources of N, P and K, so it's different sources, different forms, different sizes, actually that's when it started to change and be different. So for us, when we do our fertilizer, I think it's because different microbes are eating different things at different parts of their cycle and their function and what they're doing. So diversity to me is a lot more than just diversity of species, but it's diversity of the ingredients and the organic matter and the biology. So yeah, I think there is a lack of base nutrition for the current microbes that are in there, and I don't think they get helped with being battered mechanically.
And so, do you mean a lack of organic manures going back in being it's a source? But your point is that it's got to be multiple sources, and it's also.
I do, and I think the other thing that we've got to. What we're starting to see, though, is medicines going through animals is actually impacting the manures, which then impact the microbes. And I think, when we did a trial on a farm where we applied our compost on one side and manure on the other, and you can see on one side aerially that it's bright green because of the nitrates and it's just really high, and then on our side it's all greens and browns and lots of plants coming up from the seed bank. And I think manures are a waste that we need to use, but I think we just need to either treat it or use it with lots of others as part of it. And it's not that manures are a problem. I just think that there's something about the NPK, micro and trace elements, just need to be in balance, just like the microbial community needs to be in balance. And when we apply our fertilizers to the soils, it can't just be N. It's got to be the NPK relative to everything else that's in the soil and the plant available. So, a bit of a shout out to Logan Labs in the States, who do the analysis that does this kind of malic 3 extraction that looks at what is the plant available aspect. And it just helps you understand with microscopy what is going on with the soils. DNA is useful, but it gets really expensive and it's quite limited on what it tells you because there's still so much that's unknown.
And I just think it's because we've had a conversation about, I've got some areas of a field that's struggling. And so, do you mean the first step is microscopy, isn't it? But now it's gone dry. So we're pausing that for a bit. So it's still about this importance of testing, isn't it? And we're trying to move away from this idea of fairy dust. That we just sprinkle some stuff on and magic stuff happens and we don't have to then do any more.
But this is the thing for me. I want to empower people that are trying to make a conscious decision with both their money and their land and their crop. And it's that consciousness of, how they're doing it and what they're doing it. So it's not for me to say, do or don't do microscopy. I just don't think you'll believe me if I said, the microscopy results from your woodland, your hedge and your field will all be different. We often get people submitting samples going, I've anonymized them. You're not going to be able to tell me which one is which. And, there's a farm that I've done that's regen and there's one that's, conventional. Can you tell the difference? But when you see the numbers, it's so obvious, as to what farming system it is or what soil it is based on the, texture, feel, look and smell and feel, but also how much fungi is in there and how many nematodes and how many nutrient cyclers are in there. You can tell instantly between them whether it was compost, hedge, field or woodland. So I think the reason for the microscopy is, one, to be driven by data, being the engineer, excuse me, but I also think it's allowing you to understand the way in which your fields or land is behaving. And I had a client send in some samples, and he said, bad land, good land, need to improve. And you could see it in the results. And I think the thing is, land managers, foresters, or farmers, they know their land and they understand their land. And I think I genuinely just believe it's this last 5% of information would just empower them to then make that decision on how to either fertilize or manage. Is it the complexity of a herbal lay? What is the rotation time? Why is it taking so long to recover? All of those things become more, you can see it in the numbers when you do some microscopy.
So you're coming to Carbon Calling?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And my soil is currently being tested, because you're going to be talking on the third day, aren't you? When it's here.
Yes.
At our place. So I've sent off my samples. Slightly nervous to what you're going to think of them. we have the only thing we've done is use we used wood chip for our bedding last year, and then it was compost.
Yeah.
So I've got some fields that muck went on, and some fields which it hasn't gone on. So I don't know if that will change anything.
Yes, it will. And I think I could take 3 samples within a meter, and they'll all be relatively different to each other, and you can do it at different times of the year. I think the thing for me about microscopy is a piece of information to try and make a decision. So if you analyze your land and you say, okay, that improved it, therefore I will carry it on, or that didn't improve it, therefore I'll stop doing it. And I think it's just a decision point. It's not like a scorecard or, fungi's at 100 milligrams per milliliter. I want it to be 150. That could be the way you want to go. But I think it should be, here it is today, how can I improve? Or I did this, what does it now look like a year later? I think the interesting thing for me is, if you're doing compost, I instantly want to try and help you make better compost, because for anyone making compost, it is really hard when you don't know, but it's not much more effort to make good fungi compost. I don't know if that's going to make sense, but there is a tipping point on the way in which you make it, where you make it, and the recipes and the ingredients and the particle sizes. And I think if people have got the time, space, and ingredients, quite often farmers have enough of these resources around them to do, and quite often experiment with different composts. But what they invariably don't do is then finish the bit on the end, which is, what was it and did it work? And I think that's the bit that I've learned. It is possible to see that process with some testing.
But also, and I know Renault loves a compost heap, but also some farmers, it's not their skill set. Do you mean it's also and so there's hubs, or you can sort of see these, well, obviously products like your own, or is there hubs where there is a very good compost maker that farmers feed into?
We definitely have a lot of people coming up to us and saying, can I be your regional compost maker, please? And I think that's a really good idea, and it's totally plausible. There's lots of residues in this country that if we all sorted ourselves out, would be instantly synthetic fertilizer free by using these residues in different parts, in different combinations, in different regions. I do think that's relevant. But as you say, skill set and time mean that people don't want to make compost, and they've tried compost before and it didn't work, therefore don't want to do it again. And I get that, because it is really hard to do. But, using data, you can monitor it. That's why we made our pellets effectively, because you don't want to move water around the country, and the pellets have mother in, and effectively it was certainly
just explain mother.
Yeah, so
sourdough. I think sourdough.
Yes. We Mother Earth. I don't want to go down whether Mother Earth is a woman or a man, but let's just assume all good things come from females in this world. So Mother is what I would call our starter, our microbial community that we then keep. We've got like 40 recipes that we keep adapting and evolving, and we learn and we mix them together and we try and make the most complex microbiome possible. So if we make a batch, we'll use 10 mothers to create this fungal community bacteria. So we do that with our bulk ingredients and then our nutrition, and then we pellet it up. Now, one of the concepts we had for people that really don't want to make the best compost but want to make some compost is you make compost and then inoculate it with our mother starter. So that's kind of one way of making compost without really having to get into the detail. And the other is just use, products like ours. I don't necessarily want to be the hard sell, but we've been able to kickstart fields with as little as 60 kilos of pellets per hectare. But what we've done is used the benefit of time. So we've applied it post-harvest and then used winter, because actually microbes do proliferate over winter, which was something that we found in our seed storage trial in forestry.
Perfect. So the pellets are the pellets are just, is it like fertilizer, like chicken feed?
Yes. It's a 6 to 8 mil diameter, 6 to 8 mil long pellet that looks like wood biomass or, a chicken pellet. And the thing that we've found quite good is that they're strong enough to go through storage, transport, and through muck spreaders, lime spreaders, drills, but actually they're broken down within a couple of weeks and you can't see them. So, I think that's how, for us, it's going to work, because we don't want to be making 1 million tons of synthetic fertilizer, and the UK is wholly dependent on importing synthetics, and the carbon tax is coming in January 2027. So what is the price of fertilizer going to go up by with that tax? To me, people say, "Oh, fungi fertilizer, it sounds too good to be true if you can, reduce leaching and reduce soil kind of impacts and all the other stuff." But actually, to me, it's nuts that we're sending synthetic fertilizer down the river.
Indeed. And when you mentioned other residues, what do you mean by that? Do you mean like waste from factories or?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Waste?
Okay. No. So so blood meal, feather meal, poultry meal, and hoof and horn as an example, they've all got different mineralization rates. So some are quick, some are medium, and some are slow. All of our ingredients have been through the Soil Association approval process for organic farming, source approved verification. So there's about 30 ingredients that we have, but they're all designed to effectively feed the microbes. So they're all single source residues from processes that have already been from agriculture, fishery, and forestry.
Got you.
So no digestates, no green waste. Everything is for us to balance and blend.
I suppose it's also interesting that it's animal products, some of them. I know they're single source, but it's that importance of animal product in that.
Yes, and I don't want to swerve away from the debate on whether it should be plant or animal, or there's pros and cons and the debate to be had. But one of the things that I would say is each one of them has got a piece on whether it's calcium or whether it's got chitin in or whether it's a sugar. That everything's got a part. And there was a report from Scottish University, I think, that said, if there's a deer on the floor in a woodland, leave it there, because that will become a useful resource for the plants. And when you think about it, every part of an animal has got a part of the process for soil. And I think when you start looking through the eyes of what does fungi need, you'll start to see that the residues that we don't know what to do with historically from our processes actually should go back to feeding the soil. So I don't see things as animal or plant. I see things as their NPK kind of contribution and what they really are. So, is it chitin? Is it organic matter? Is it some nitrogen? Is it phosphorus? Is it potassium? What? And that's the beauty about natural products. It's not just one thing that it has in it.
I suppose it's also that it's the whole cycle, isn't it? It's coming, like bringing that meat processing product that might go through your process that comes back on the farm. It's Julian, we're extractive in our form, which is we sell lots of stuff on the farm and then we buy it in as synthetics. So it's just trying to understand the cycle.
Yes, I think the thing that is interesting though is, in the Wye Valley they've got a problem with too much chicken manure because they don't want to transport it. It's not that chicken manure is a problem; it's just that it's used in the wrong form. And I think this is at least the conversation I hope we can start to have in this country is about it's not about a residue being a problem; it's the way in which we use the residue. And I think, like you say, the soil needs lots of different things. So whether it be a manure or chicken manure, cow manure, it needs to be in combination to level out these NPKs and the nitrates and the solubilities and the salts and, the mineralization rates of the microbes, and also having enough microbes on the land to actually process them. Otherwise, they're just going to go and disappear down the river if they're soluble.
And your point about that actually a lot of the source of that was from the food web, wasn't it? It was from the insects, it was from bird poo, it was all of that stuff that as biodiversity has declined, that source of nutrient is also changing.
Yeah, but we've also gone to these mega factories for our abattoirs. We used to have lots of abattoirs. Now they're just becoming single consortiums and big factories. So, you wouldn't have had that material back. I often describe what we're doing as what your grandfather's father would have done, but we've just now done DNA and microscopy to understand why it worked. And this comes back to where I started, which was my nan was using, I think it was pig manure and donkey manure that got her roses looking really good compared to everybody else who was using cow. Why it was relevant, there'll be something in the data somewhere as to why she was able to grow roses better than everybody else. But we just didn't understand. And I think it's that premise of finding the best way of using that data to make an informed decision.
I wonder what she'd think of your fungi pellets.
I hope she'd be proud.
I think if it grew amazing roses, she wouldn't care. The outcome is the rose and beating everybody else.
Yes.
Oh, interesting. Thank you. But yeah, so you're doing a workshop at Nic's on the Thursday. So if people are interested, they can come and listen to you then.
Yeah, we'll cover a few topics. We'll talk about composting, we'll talk about nutrition, and we'll talk about soil health and that cycle. Because if you're doing SAP analysis and you're trying to work out how to get nutrition into your grains, it's all about the microbes and it's all about the nutrition. And I think the only thing that's missing is looking and understanding what your microbes are and how do you improve them and look after them. I don't think this is a new topic, really. I think it's the how piece, isn't it? And also, and I suppose it's the theme that stretches through quite a lot of the conference, which is the how at scale. Yes.
So how do we do it so we can get it onto, in the next 5 years, most farmers are confident and using biological amendments appropriately. And
one of the things that's really striking is, and I know by the name Carbon Calling, fungi fertilizer is 99% less CO2 than synthetic fertilizer. The numbers are staggering. For every 1 ton of synthetic fertilizer used, it's taken 5 tons of CO2 to make it. Whereas when we make our fertilizer, it's about 120 kilo per ton. And then when you account for any of the biomass that comes from the plant thereafter, there is an argument to say that is carbon free. And I don't want to claim that, but that's the mindset we should be thinking about with net zero. Not that it's really hard and I've got to drive an EV everywhere. Actually, what and how we grow our food and the environment we live in, from forestry, agroforestry to agriculture, can be done with the power of microbes, if only we can feed them and monitor them and look after them.
Thank you for listening to the Regen Ag podcast. Huge thanks to our sponsor Tim Nicholson from Cactus Tree Guards, Reno for the music, and Pete Ord, the podcast wizard from the studio at Sunbeams, part of the Annie Mawson Sunbeams Music Trust. See you next time.